poor young Omega let a stranger stay for one night, unaware he was the cold Alpha King. The wind howled through the forest, rattling the branches against the small, lonely cottage. Rain fell in thick sheets, drumming against the wooden roof, and the forest seemed to grow darker with every passing moment. Inside, Elias, a young Omega, sat near the fireplace warming his hands. He had lived alone for as long as he could remember, surviving on the small harvest from his garden, the few herbs he gathered, and the meager earnings from selling herbs to the nearby village. Payer. Life had always been quiet, simple, and safe, or at least as safe as a life in the forest could be. Tonight, however, the forest felt different. The wind carried an urgency, almost as if it whispered of danger. Elias shivered, not from the cold, but from the feeling that something was coming. He tried to ignore it, pulling his shawl tighter around his shoulders, and returned to his small stack of books. He had always found comfort in their words, the stories of faraway lands, kings, and heroes, though he had never imagined that his own life might one day be touched by such tales. A sudden knock on the door made Elias jump. The storm made every sound sharper, more frightening, and he froze for a moment. The knock came again, urgent but polite. Elias hesitated. Visitors were rare, and strangers were rarer still. Yet something in the way the knock echoed against the wood felt desperate. With a careful hand he opened the door. Standing there, soaked to the bone, was a man he had never seen before. Presence was commanding, though not in the way a soldier or noble might command. No, this man carried a quiet power, something that seemed to bend the very air around him. His eyes were piercing, gray as winter skies, and they seemed to look through Elias, as if he could see not just the body, but the soul. I'm sorry to bother you, the stranger said, his voice low and steady. The storm... I need shelter for the night. His instinct screamed caution. He knew enough of the world to understand that travelers in storms were often trouble. And yet there was something in the stranger's eyes that stirred a strange mix of fear and trust. Perhaps it was desperation. Perhaps it was more. "Come in," Elias said finally, stepping aside. "The fire will warm you." The stranger moved into the cottage with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. He shook the water from his cloak and gloves, leaving small puddles on the wooden floor, and Elias offered him a seat near the fire. "I am Elias," he said, trying to sound confident despite the flutter in his chest. "Despre." The man inclined his head slightly. "Alaric," he said. His eyes lingered on Elias a moment longer than necessary, and the young Omega felt a strange warmth in his chest, like the hearth's fire had suddenly moved inside him. For a long while neither spoke. The storm raged outside, the wind and rain creating a world apart, as if the cottage existed in a bubble untouched by the rest of the kingdom. Elias busied himself by fetching a blanket, offering it to Alaric. The stranger accepted it, his movements careful, deliberate, and yet somehow effortless. "You live alone?" Alaric asked finally, his voice breaking the silence. It was not a question meant to pry, but a simple observation, and Elias felt strangely exposed by it. "Yes," Elias replied softly. I like it that way. Peaceful. Quiet." Alaric's eyes flicked around the small cottage, taking in the sparse furniture, the books stacked on the shelves, and the small herbs drying near the window. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, before turning his gaze back to Elias.
"Peace can be fragile," he said, his voice low and thoughtful, "especially in a world full of storms."
Elias shivered again, not entirely from the cold. There was something about this man, something that both frightened and intrigued him. He could not put his finger on it, but he felt as though a thread had connected them the moment Alaric had stepped inside. They ate a small meal together, Elias speaking softly about the village, the forest, and the herbs he tended. Alaric listened, asking few questions, but when he did, his voice carried a weight that made Elias pause. Every so often Elias would glance at him, noticing the faint frost that clung to his hair and the way his presence seemed to pull the warmth from the room. After the meal, Elias returned to the fire to fetch another log. When he turned, he froze. Alaric was standing closer to him than before, his eyes fixed on Elias in a way that made the young Omega's heart pound.
"Why did you let me in?" Alaric asked quietly.
Desperation. Bah! You do not know who I am. I couldn't leave you in the storm, Elias said, his voice trembling slightly. No one should be out in weather like this alone. Alaric's gaze softened just slightly, and for a moment Elias thought he saw something like relief, or perhaps curiosity, flicker across the stranger's face.
"You are brave," Alaric said, almost to himself.
And kind. Too kind for your own good. Elias felt his cheeks flush. The words carried weight, though he did not understand why. There was a pull in the air between them, invisible yet undeniable. The fire crackled as the night deepened. Outside, the storm showed no sign of relenting, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Alaric moved to sit near the fire, and Elias found himself drawn into the stranger's presence, unable to look away. There was a coldness about him, yes, but beneath it was something else, something Elias could not name, but something that promised both danger and warmth. Hours passed in silence, punctuated only by the wind and the occasional pop from the fire. Elias tried to focus on the books in his hands, but his thoughts kept returning to Alaric, the way he spoke, the way he moved, the way the firelight reflected in his eyes. It was as if the stranger carried a world within him, one that Elias could not enter yet longed to. Then, just as Elias was about to suggest he prepare a bedroll for Alaric, the man's eyes widened. He lifted his hand, and Elias noticed a faint glow pulsing from his palm. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but in the firelight it shimmered like a whisper of magic. Buy-in. Elias took a step back, fear and awe intertwining in his chest. What is that? He asked softly. Alaric's face was unreadable, a mask of calm that could hide storms. It is not mine, he said quietly, but it is yours. Elias frowned, confused. Mine? How? What do you mean? He simply watched Elias, as though waiting for him to understand something that was far beyond the young Omega's comprehension. The air in the room seemed to thrum with tension, and Elias felt a strange heat in his chest, a pull toward the stranger that was both terrifying and irresistible. You are connected to things you do not yet understand, Alaric said finally, things that could change your life, and mine, forever. Death's heart raced in a way he had never felt before. There was a depth to Alaric, a shadow beneath the surface, and Elias knew, intuitively, that his life had just shifted. The quiet days in his cottage, the simple, safe life he had built, were over. What do you mean? Elias whispered. Connected. How? Alaric's gaze softened just enough for Elias to see a flicker of something human, something vulnerable. It is not time for you to know yet, he said, but soon. You will see. And when that happens, your life will never be the same. The young Omega's mind spun with questions, but before he could speak, the glow in his hand flared briefly, then faded. Alaric took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. Elias felt the pull again, stronger than before, as if some invisible thread had tied them together in the storm-lit cottage. I will stay, Elias said softly, almost to himself. But
I do not know what this means.
Alaric nodded, as though Elias's words were exactly what he needed to hear.
for a moment the two of them stood in silence, the firelight dancing across their faces, and the storm outside raging as if in warning. Then, just before the first light of dawn crept through the window, Alaric's eyes flicked down to Elias's hand, and his face changed.
Something ancient, something fearful, something desperate appeared in his eyes.
You are far more than you seem, he whispered, his voice trembling with a weight that made Elias's heart constrict.
Tori, and if you do not know it yet, soon you will. Elias looked down at his hand, still faintly warm from the fire, still feeling the echo of the glow that had disappeared. He did not understand. He did not know what Alaric meant, but something deep inside him told him that nothing would ever be the same again. The storm outside began to ease, but inside Elias's small cottage, a different storm had begun. One of fear, longing, and a curiosity he could not contain. And as he watched the stranger, the man who had arrived at his door as if by fate, Elias realized that the night was only the beginning, and that his quiet life, the life he had always known, had vanished like smoke in the wind. The morning sun barely pierced the dense clouds that hung over the forest. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving the world damp and quiet. Elias stood by the window, staring at the faint mist curling through the trees. His mind still raced from the events of the night. The stranger, Alaric, was not just any traveler. Something about him, the way he had looked at Elias, the glow in his hand, the words he had spoken. It all seemed unreal, as if Elias had stepped into one of the stories from his books. He turned when the door creaked open. Alaric was already dressed, his cloak now dry, and his gaze was steady, but there was a tension in his shoulders that Elias had not seen before. "We must go," Alaric said quietly, his voice calm but firm.
You cannot remain here, not when your life, your gift,
has begun to awaken.
Elias hesitated.
Go? Where? I don't understand. I have never left this forest. Alaric stepped closer, his eyes scanning the small cottage as if measuring every detail. There are places you must see, truths you must learn.
My kingdom it calls to you. Elias frowned, confused and a little afraid.
Your kingdom? Yes, Alaric said. I am its king.
And you are part of its future. The words struck Elias like a thunderclap. A king, a stranger. And somehow he felt connected to this man in a way he could not explain. He wanted to run, to hide, to tell himself this was impossible. But part of him, deep, hidden, and curious, wanted to follow. Alaric extended his hand, an unspoken offer of protection, of guidance. Elias took it, trembling slightly. The moment their fingers touched, a warmth spread through him, and for a brief second he saw visions. Cold, towering castles, halls filled with whispers, and a kingdom trapped in shadow. And in the center of it all, Alaric, standing alone, staring into a darkness only he could feel. When the vision ended, Elias gasped. What was that? Alaric's eyes softened, just slightly, but his face remained serious. It is what you will help me change, but it will not be easy. The journey to the kingdom was long. Alaric moved with a speed and grace that made the forest seem to blur around them. Elias struggled to keep up, his mind racing with questions and doubts. But every time he looked at Alaric, his fear mixed with something else, something electric, powerful, and impossible to ignore. When the gates of the kingdom rose before them, Elias's breath caught. The city stretched far and wide, towers piercing the clouds, streets lined with marble, and walls that seemed to hum with ancient magic. Guards in polished armor regarded Alaric with respect, bowing as he passed, but their eyes lingered on Elias with suspicion. "Stay close," Alaric whispered, his hand brushing against Elias's shoulder. The contact sent a shiver through him. Here, the world is different. Eyes are everywhere. Trust few and fear none but what is hidden. The palace itself was massive, a labyrinth of halls, chambers, and corridors. Alaric led Elias through its winding paths, explaining little, yet Elias felt the weight of history in every stone. Portraits of kings and queens lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow him, whispering silently of power, betrayal, and duty. "You will meet the council today," Alaric said, stopping in a grand hall where sunlight filtered through stained glass. "They must know of your presence, but be cautious. Some may not welcome you." Elias swallowed hard. The thought of facing a group of strangers, all powerful and important, terrified him. Yet, as he looked at Alaric, he felt a courage he had never known. Somehow he had to be brave. The council chamber was larger than any room Elias had ever seen. Candles burned along the walls, their flames flickering as if alive. At the center, men and women in fine robes and armor regarded him with scrutiny, whispers floating through the air. Alaric stepped forward, his posture commanding silence. "This is Elias," Alaric announced. "He comes not as a visitor, but as one whose destiny is tied to our kingdom." Whispers grew louder, pierced him, but he stood tall, his heart racing. There was a power in Alaric's presence that made the council hold their tongues, yet their suspicion lingered like a shadow. "Destiny." One council member finally spoke, her voice sharp. "He is but a boy from the forest. Bad. How can his fate be tied to the kingdom?" Alaric's gaze was icy. "Do not mistake youth for weakness. One carries a bond older than you or I, a bond that can change the fate of all."
Elias felt his cheeks burn.
He did not understand what Alaric meant. All he knew was that he was far from home, standing in a place of power he had only imagined in his books, and his heart beat like a drum against his ribs. Days passed, each filled with lessons, introductions, and more questions than answers. Elias learned that the kingdom was under a curse, one that had slowly frozen the land and hardened the hearts of those who ruled it. Alaric, despite his cold exterior and fearsome reputation, carried the weight of this curse upon him. It had shaped him, hardened him, and yet Elias began to see glimpses of the man beneath the mask, the lonely, burdened soul who longed for something he had almost forgotten. One evening Elias wandered the palace gardens, the moonlight reflecting on the fountain's water. He felt restless, unable to shake the tension in his chest. He sensed someone behind him before he heard the footsteps. "Why do you linger here alone?" Alaric's voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried through the garden like a command. I needed air," Elias said. "It is all so much to take in." Alaric stepped closer, his presence overwhelming yet strangely comforting. "You are stronger than you know," he said. "Brave enough to face this world, yet gentle enough to remind it of warmth." The words felt like a revelation. He had never considered himself brave or strong. And yet, in the presence of this man, he felt both. Do you think I can help?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alaric studied him for a long moment. If you are willing, yes. But it will not be easy. The path you have entered is fraught with shadows, trials, and sacrifices. And sometimes, those we care for most may be the ones we cannot save. Elias swallowed, the weight of Alaric's words pressing on him. Fear mingled with determination. Bah.
He did not fully understand what lay ahead, but he knew that he could not turn back, not now.
Des bah. Not when something deep inside him had awakened, a feeling, a connection, a calling that could not be ignored.
As the nights grew longer, Elias began to notice more about Alaric.
The way he walked through halls, commanding without raising his voice. The way his eyes lingered on the young Omega, not in judgment, but in study, curiosity, and something deeper. And though Alaric rarely spoke of himself, the glimpses Elias caught, the quiet moments, the brief flashes of vulnerability, made him realize that this man, this king, was not as cold as the stories suggested. One night, as the wind moaned through the palace towers, Alaric summoned Elias to the private library. The room was vast, lined with books and scrolls, and the flickering fire painted shadows across the walls. Alaric closed the door behind them, his expression unreadable. "There is something I must show you," he said. He reached out, placing a hand on the table. The air seemed to hum with power. "Your bond, your gift, is older than you realize, and it connects not just to me, but to the kingdom itself." Elias stepped closer, fear and fascination warring inside him. "What do you mean?" Elias' gaze met his, unwavering and intense. "There are forces at work here, old as the stones of this castle. Forces that can destroy or protect. And you are tied to them, in ways that will shape everything." The young Omega's heart raced. He wanted to ask questions, to run, to deny it all. But he could not. Truth in Alaric's eyes. An unspoken certainty that left no room for doubt.
"You must learn quickly," Alaric continued.
The curse grows stronger. Shadows move in ways even I cannot always predict. "And there are those who will try to use you to control what you cannot yet understand." Elias nodded, his resolve hardening. He did not fully understand the danger, but he knew one thing. He could not leave. Not now. Not when he had glimpsed the connection, the purpose, the bond that tied him to Alaric in the kingdom. As he turned to leave, a sudden vision passed before his eyes, flickers of fire and frost, of shadowed halls and voices whispering his name. He gasped, gripping the edge of the table. Alaric's eyes widened in recognition and fear. "You are far more than you seem," Alaric whispered. "And if you do not know it yet, soon you will." The firelight danced across their faces, casting long shadows that merged and twisted together. The bond between them, invisible yet undeniable, had begun to take root. And as Elias left the library, the weight of destiny pressing upon him, he realized that the palace, the king, the curse, and the storm that had brought them together had only just begun. Outside, the wind howled through the towers, carrying whispers of a future that was uncertain, dangerous, and yet full of promise. Elias could feel it deep in his bones. The life he had known was gone, replaced by one filled with shadows, trials, and a connection that neither time nor fear could sever. Palace. And in the quiet of the palace night, Alaric watched him go, his mind torn between duty, fear, and the first stirring of a feeling he had long thought impossible: hope. The palace was alive with whispers. Every corridor, every hall, every candlelit chamber seemed to murmur secrets. Elias had grown accustomed to the grandeur, but not yet to the weight of it. The statues, the banners, the eyes of painted kings, they all seemed to watch him, silently judging, silently waiting. And through it all, Alaric's presence loomed like a shadow he could never escape. Elias had learned much since arriving. He had begun training in the ways of the palace, etiquette, understanding the subtle power of words, and even a little of the strange magic that seemed woven into the stones themselves. The palace library was his refuge. Scrolls and books filled with old histories, forgotten curses, and legends of rulers who had tamed kingdoms or been destroyed by them became his guides. But it was not knowledge alone that Elias felt stirring within him. It was power, his own, faint yet undeniable, pulsing in his veins like a heartbeat he had only just discovered. And with it a connection to Alaric that made his chest tighten, his thoughts scatter, and his nights restless. Alaric, for his part, grew both protective and wary. His eyes followed Elias more than he intended, lingering in ways that were almost imperceptible to others. He kept his distance, yet could not entirely resist the pull he felt toward the young Omega. Alaric's heart, long frozen by the burden of the crown and the curse, was awakening in ways he did not understand and could not control. One evening, as the sun dipped behind distant mountains, Alaric summoned Elias to the highest tower of the palace. The wind blew fiercely against the tall windows, carrying the scent of rain and distant pine. "You have grown stronger," Alaric said, his voice low and measured. "And yet there are shadows you have not yet faced." Elias shivered, both from the wind and the weight of those words. "Shadows? What do you mean?" Alaric approached, his figure looming in the firelight, and placed a hand gently on Elias's shoulder. "The curse that grips this kingdom is older than any living soul here. It twists hearts, turns allies into enemies, and feeds on fear. That is dangerous, and that is why I brought you here." Elias looked down at his hands, unsure what to say. Fear and excitement warred within him. He had never imagined himself a part of such a story, and yet the connection he felt with Alaric, and the strange warmth that pulsed within him whenever the Alpha King was near, made him certain that he could not turn away. "You are not just a boy from the forest," Alaric continued. "You are part of something greater. A force that could save this kingdom or be its undoing."
Elias swallowed hard. I don't know if I can. Alaric's gaze softened, just slightly, though the intensity in his eyes remained.
"You can. I will guide you. But you must trust yourself and me." Days passed with lessons that tested both mind and heart. Alaric taught Elias to sense the currents of magic within the palace, to feel the subtle pull of emotions from those around him, and to understand the delicate balance of power that held the kingdom together. Elias discovered that even small gestures, a word spoken at the right moment, a gentle touch of reassurance, could sway allies and deter enemies. Yet with every lesson, Elias also sensed the distance in Alaric. The king was cold in public, commanding and feared, but in private there were moments of hesitation, almost vulnerability. Elias noticed the way Alaric's shoulders slumped when he thought no one watched, the brief flickers of longing in his eyes, and the faint sadness that lingered even in his rare smiles.
One night, Elias could not sleep.
The moonlight spilled through his window, illuminating the small chamber where he lay. The glow on his hand, the faint pulse of magic that had appeared the night he met Alaric, had returned. It throbbed softly, calling to him. He rose and wandered through the quiet corridors drawn by instinct rather than intention. He found himself at the edge of the courtyard, where the gardens lay bathed in silver light. The fountain's water shimmered like molten glass, and the night air was thick with the scent of roses and damp stone. And there, leaning against the marble railing of the highest terrace, stood Alaric. You shouldn't be out here, Alaric said, his voice gentle yet firm. Yes, especially now. Elias stepped closer, his hands trembling slightly. I couldn't sleep. The magic? It's stronger tonight. Alaric studied him for a long moment. Yes, he said finally. Brow.
It is responding to you and to me. His eyes softened in a way Elias had never seen before.
You have awakened something in me, something I thought long buried. Elias's heart skipped a beat. Me? Yes, Alaric admitted, though his words were cautious. Your presence, your courage, your heart.
You remind me of what I once hoped to be, and what I fear I no longer can.
The words hung in the air like smoke, delicate yet heavy. Elias wanted to speak, to ask questions, to understand, but the moment held him silent. He felt a warmth radiate from Alaric, mixing with the pulse in his own hand. And for the first time, he felt that the threads connecting them were real, not just magic.
But something deeper, something unspoken. You are not alone, Alaric continued.
Even in the darkness of this kingdom, you are not alone. Elias's throat tightened. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the truth of those words. He had lived a quiet, lonely life in the forest, yet here, in the moonlit palace gardens, he realized that loneliness could be replaced by trust, courage, and even connection. The night stretched on. They spoke of the kingdom, of the curse, and of the strange visions that had brought Elias here. Alaric admitted, though with restraint, that the curse was tied to his own family line, a burden he had carried for decades. The kingdom had grown cold because its ruler had grown cold, a truth that was both terrifying and painfully honest. You must understand, Alaric said quietly, that the curse feeds on fear and doubt. It grows stronger when hearts are closed. Dask, it weakens only when there is trust, warmth, and courage. That is why you are important. You bring warmth where there is frost. Elias felt a shiver, not of cold, but of recognition. P did not fully understand the depth of what Alaric was saying, yet he felt the truth of it in his bones. And as he looked at the king, this man who had seemed untouchable, almost otherworldly, he realized that he could help him. Somehow, he could make a difference. Days turned into weeks. Trained, learned, and grew stronger, but the shadows around the kingdom also grew. Rumors spread of unrest, whispers of those who sought to take advantage of the curse, and hints of powers beyond even Alaric's control. Elias sensed it all, the pulse of the land, the tremors in the palace walls, and the invisible threads that tied him to Alaric and the kingdom. One evening, as they studied an ancient scroll together, Elias felt it, an urgent pull from the palace, a tugging in his chest that he could not explain.
He looked up at Alaric.
I feel something, he said, his voice trembling. Something is coming. He rose and stepped to the window, staring out at the moonlit kingdom. Yes, he said finally. The curse stirs. Forces we cannot yet see are moving. And soon they will test us. Elias felt a mixture of fear and determination. He did not fully understand what lay ahead, but he knew that he could not turn away. Not now. Not when Alaric's trust and the fate of the kingdom rested in part in his hands. That night, Elias could not sleep again. The pulse in his hand grew stronger, almost like a heartbeat, echoing the rhythm of his own. He rose once more and wandered to the terrace, where Alaric awaited, silent and steady. You feel it too, Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alaric nodded. Disk, the connection between us. It is deeper than you know, and it will guide us through what is coming. Elias's chest tightened. The fear, the excitement, and the strange, powerful bond between them created a storm inside him more intense than any outside. Best, he realized that he had begun to care for Alaric, not as a king, not as a stranger, but as someone who had touched his soul in ways he could not yet name.
And yet, Alaric said quietly, care is dangerous in a place like this.
Love, connection, they can be weapons if you are not careful.
Alyrus met his gaze, then we must be careful together? Alaric's lips pressed into a thin line.
Yes, together. The night stretched, long and quiet, but full of unspoken truths. And as the first light of dawn touched the palace towers, Elias understood one thing clearly. He could no longer imagine a life without Alaric, and the kingdom would demand courage, trust, and love from both of them if they were to survive the coming trials. The wind howled through the palace towers, rattling the windows and stirring the shadows along the stone walls. Elias stood at the terrace, feeling the chill of the night, but also something stronger, something alive within him. The pulse of magic, the pull of destiny, and the bond that had grown between him and Alaric over the weeks in the palace.
Alaric appeared silently behind him, his cloak brushing against the stone. For a moment, neither spoke.
They only felt the rhythm of the night, the quiet tension, and the strange connection that bound them together. The curse grows stronger, Alaric said finally, his voice low and grave. I can feel it in the land, in the palace, even in the hearts of my people. Soon it will reach its peak. Elias clenched his fists. Then we stop it. Together. Alaric turned to him, his eyes softer than usual, yet filled with the weight of centuries. You do not fully understand the danger. Not even I can control all that is coming.
But you have something I no longer possess.
Hope. Light. Descaré.
Elias's heart ached at the words.
He had always feared his own smallness, his own insignificance in the grand world of kings and curses. Yet here, standing before Alaric, he realized that he had the power to matter, to be the difference. Before they could plan further, a sudden tremor shook the palace. Stones cracked, and the air seemed to hum with a strange, dark energy. Psst. Elias gasped.
The curse! Alaric's expression darkened.
It is here. He took Elias's hand, feeling the faint pulse of magic between them. We must go to the heart of the palace. Now. They ran through corridors twisting with shadows, through halls echoing with whispers of old sorrows, and into the central chamber of the castle. There, a faint icy mist swirled, freezing the air and chilling the stone beneath their feet. The curse had manifested, feeding on fear, doubt, and the coldness that had long gripped Alaric's heart. Elias felt the pulse in his hand grow stronger, brighter, and warmer. He realized that the connection between him and Alaric was not merely emotional. It was magical. His courage, his trust, his light could touch the heart of the curse and weaken it. Death.
Alaric! Elias said, his voice trembling but determined. You don't have to face this alone.
I am here. We can do it. Together. Alaric's eyes softened, and for a moment, the coldness that had always surrounded him seemed to melt. I am not sure I can, he admitted quietly, almost to himself. I have carried this burden for so long I do not know if I am strong enough.
You are strong, Elias said firmly, not because you have power, but because you care, even when it is hard.
That is what matters. That is what will break the curse. Alaric swallowed hard, taking a steadying breath. He looked at Elias, really looked, and for the first time he allowed himself to feel the warmth of trust and hope without fear. "Then let us do it," he said. They stepped forward together. The mist of the curse thickened, twisting into shapes that seemed almost alive. Shadows moved like frozen figures, echoing whispers of the kingdom's pain and Alaric's long isolation.
Elias reached out, his hand glowing with the light of his heart, and the pulse radiated into the mist. At first, nothing seemed to happen.
The shadows writhed, dark and menacing. But Elias did not falter. He focused on Alaric, on the trust between them, on the courage that had grown in the young Omega's chest. He felt the warmth grow, stronger and brighter, pushing against the cold and the fear. Alaric joined him, placing his hand over Elias's, letting the bond between them guide the magic. The pulse of light surged, flowing outward, touching the walls, the ceiling, the frozen heart of the palace. The mist screamed and shivered, twisting into shapes of shadow before dissolving into nothingness. The air warmed. The stones of the palace seemed to sigh in relief. The curse had begun to break. Alaric's chest rose and fell rapidly. For the first time in decades, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He turned to Elias, eyes shining with gratitude, fear, and something far deeper.
You?
"You saved me," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "No," Elias replied softly. "We saved each other." The young Omega stepped closer, their hands still joined.
The pulse of magic had faded, but the warmth between them remained, stronger than ever.
Alaric's eyes searched Elias's face, vulnerable and open, and he realized that the walls he had built around his heart, the coldness, the distance, the fear, were no longer needed. "I feared I would always be alone," Alaric admitted. "But you changed that." Elias smiled, feeling the same truth in his own heart. "You are not alone. Not now. Not ever." Outside, the first light of dawn broke over the kingdom, painting the towers with gold and silver. The frost that had lingered on the castle stones began to melt, revealing the marble beneath. Birds sang, and the palace, once heavy with sorrow and shadow, seemed to breathe freely for the first time in centuries. Alaric led Elias to the grand balcony overlooking the kingdom. The view stretched as far as the eye could see, fields thawed, rivers gleaming in the sunlight, and the people below beginning their day with cautious hope. "This is the result of your courage," Alaric said quietly. "Not mine alone, yours." Elias looked out over the kingdom, feeling the truth of the words. He had always thought himself small, insignificant, an Omega who only lived quietly at the edge of the forest. But here, standing beside the Alpha King, he realized that courage and light came in many forms, and that even the smallest heart could change the world. For a long moment they stood together in silence, letting the morning sun warm their faces, letting the gentle breeze carry away the remnants of shadow. And in that silence a bond was solidified, a bond of trust, courage, and love that neither curse nor fear could break.
Alaric finally spoke, his voice strong but tender. "There will be challenges ahead."
Shadows will always return, as they always do. But together, we can face them. Together, we are stronger than any curse, stronger than any shadow.
Elias turned to him, heart full.
I believe that, and I will not leave you.
Not now, not ever, brushing a strand of hair from Elias's face. The gesture was simple, intimate, but it carried a depth of feeling that words could never capture.
"Then we begin anew,"
he said. They returned to the palace together, ready to face the future as partners, as equals. as the light against the shadows. The kingdom, once cold and lifeless, began to bloom with hope, and the pulse of magic that had been dormant for centuries flowed once more. Alive, vibrant, and tied forever to the courage of a young Omega and the heart of the Alpha King. But even as peace settled over the palace, a faint whisper lingered in the wind, a reminder that the world was never without challenges, that darkness always waited at the edges of light. Yet Elias no longer feared it. He knew that with Alaric by his side, with trust and courage in his heart, he could face anything. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light across the towers, Alaric and Elias stood on the terrace once more. Alaric's eyes softened, and he allowed himself to smile, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes and lit them with warmth. "You have changed me," he said softly, "more than I thought anyone could."
And you have given me a home, Elias replied. A place where I belong.
"And a future I never imagined."
For the first time in their lives, both knew that they were not defined by fear, shadow, or curse.
They were defined by trust, courage, and the bond they had forged in the heart of the palace, strong, unbroken, and shining like a beacon for the kingdom below. And in that moment, the palace, the kingdom, and their hearts all breathed freely, knowing that even in a world of shadows, light, true, unyielding light, could always prevail.